Hey everyone, in this program, I want to talk about a region and people who many of us in the West, even if we're not familiar with ancient history of the Near East, have probably heard of. Specifically, I'm talking about a land called Canaan and its inhabitants, known loosely as Canaanites. The story of this land and its people is really interesting and plays into the overall narrative of the history of the ancient Near East. So, let's get into it. Most people who have heard the terms Canaan and Canaanite know them from the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible. For example, in the book of Genesis, chapter 10, in the Table of Nations, Canaan is said to be the grandson of Noah, the son of Ham, from whom the Jebusites, Amorites, and another group called the Hivites trace their descent from. Now, if you're well versed in Egyptian history, you've no doubt encountered the Canaanites there as well, especially during the mid to late Bronze Age period. In general, the Canaanites were a group of Semitic peoples who during the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE occupied parts of what are today the countries of modern Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, northern Syria, and western Jordan. Now, this is actually a very broad term. I say broad because what we often lump together as Canaanites were really a number of tribal groups, city-states, and kingdoms that occupied a particular region. While they had many similarities, they also had distinct social and cultural traits. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into all of these subgroups over here. Perhaps though, we can save them for another video. The first written references to Canaan or Canaanites appears in the Mari archives of the 18th century BCE. Actually, there may also be references to them in 24th century archive tablets from the city of Ebeling, but this is something that's hard to confirm for linguists of ancient languages. Now, along with the book of Genesis mentioned earlier, Canaan and Canaanites are also mentioned in the book of Numbers, chapter 13, verse 29. Mentioning them along with other peoples, the text state, and I quote, "The Amalekites live in the land of the Negeb. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites live in the hill country. And the Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan." Text and letters found in Egypt also describe a similar geography. In the Amarna letters from the 14th century BCE, this land is called Kinahu or Kinanu, i.e. Canaan. So, we're looking at an area between the Mediterranean Sea and the west bank of the Jordan River. That's from east to west. North to south is a bit less defined, but it probably stretched from north or central Lebanon down to the Negev desert. Canaan's location at the nexus of the Western Asian, Mediterranean, and Egyptian worlds put it at the crossroads of several major trade routes. The land was also strategic militarily, for whoever controlled it not only had a foothold in Western Asia, but access to the Mediterranean Sea, and was more or less within striking distance of Egypt, southeastern Anatolia, northern Syria, Cyprus, and, if one were ambitious enough, most of northeastern Mesopotamia. By the early Bronze Age, a number of flourishing urban communities had sprung up all over Canaan. Though not super large, these urban settlements had fortified walls, inside of which were temples, public buildings, scores of housing blocks, and other structures that seemed to be where craftsmen and artisans worked. These urban centers were almost always surrounded and supported by farmland and small villages. For the most part, the farms grew olives, grain, some vegetables, and various types of beans. Many of these early settlements were the forerunners of the various established kingdoms and city-states that we eventually come across in the Middle and Late Bronze Ages. Now, the lucrative trade routes that passed through Canaan were a mixed blessing. On one hand, they brought lots of exotic goods and wealth into the region. On the other, it made controlling the lands and cities of Canaan a foreign policy objective for many of the surrounding kingdoms and empires. As can be expected, there's plenty of evidence of trade between Canaan and Egypt, as well as the wider Near East. Pottery from Canaan has been discovered in Egyptian cemeteries, and likewise, pottery from Egypt has been found throughout Canaan as well. Traces of goods from Mesopotamia, Anatolia, parts of Iran, and even Central Asia have been found in Canaan. Of these though, Canaan's commercial links with Egypt were the most important. An example of this was around the year 2200 BCE, when the Old Kingdom of Egypt collapsed, bringing a sharp decline in the economy of Canaan, as well as the abandonment of a number of Canaanite cities and settlements. By around the period we call the Middle Bronze Age, roughly 2000 to 1550 BCE, we start to see the rise of various city-states and kingdoms. These urban enclaves became centers of trade and commerce, as well as cultural centers where more sophisticated art and literature flourished. These years, between 1750 to 1550 BCE, were a sort of golden age in Canaanite history. During this time, Canaan's ties to Egypt not only increased, but stronger ties with Anatolia, Syria, Cyprus, and the greater Aegean world as well. Some of the more prosperous urban centers were Akko, Ashkelon, Hazor, Lachish, Megiddo, Sechem, Tyre, and, all the way in the north, Ugarit. Politically, these city-states were independent of each other, though it's apparent that they often fought over whatever land and scarce resources were available. There was from time to time cooperation between them, such as forming military coalitions for the purpose of defending against a common enemy. The earliest written campaigns we have against the Canaanites occurred during the reign of the Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose I. Ruling between the years 1504 to 1492 BCE, Thutmose sought to create a defensive buffer between the Egyptian heartland and the wider Near East. Control of Canaan was obviously one of the best ways to accomplish this. He waged war in Canaan and northern Syria, obtaining the allegiance of several Canaanite city-states and smaller kingdoms. However, upon his death, these vassals stopped paying their tribute and more or less became independent of Egyptian rule. It wasn't until the reign of Thutmose III that Canaan and much of northern Syria definitively became territories of Egypt. In 1457 BCE, Thutmose III won a decisive victory against a coalition of Canaanite, Syrian, and other Mitanni allied forces at the Battle of Megiddo. From then onward, Egypt held a relatively firm grip over Canaan, at least for a few hundred years. Canaanite city-states and kingdoms became vassals of the pharaoh, and for the most part continued to thrive due to the centuries-old cultural and commercial ties they had with Egypt. This stability also allowed Canaanite merchants to increase trade with other peoples, especially those in Cyprus and the wider Mediterranean world. Thus, Canaanite cities, especially those along the coast, became extremely wealthy. And, since they were under the rule of and paid tribute to the pharaoh, the Egyptians also benefited from this. In all, it was really a win-win situation for everyone. This situation, though, was not to last. By around the mid-12th century BCE, the Egyptians were gradually withdrawing from the region, in part due to great numbers of peoples who were swarming into Canaan and the surrounding lands. Simply known today as the Sea Peoples, they overran much of the western half of the Near East during the 12th and 11th centuries, and contributed to the collapse of the Hittite Empire in central and southwestern Anatolia. The towns and cities of Canaan were also greatly affected by the chaos, with archaeological evidence showing that many of them were abandoned around this time. While the Egyptians were able to withstand against them in the Nile Delta, they weren't able to simultaneously hold on to their once valuable possessions in Canaan. Now, for historians and archaeologists alike, the 12th century BCE was also a pivotal time for the region because it marked the end of the Bronze Age and ushered in what we call the Iron Age. It's also around this time that the historical records of the Egyptians, as well as the Old Testament of the Bible, mention a couple of new groups occupying parts of Canaan. One of them was called the Philistines, the other, the Israelites. In the beginning, these two groups probably lived together peacefully, shepherding their flocks and tending to the land. However, the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible, one of our primary sources in this case, tells of how conflict arose between them. Though often defined and described in religious terms, the conflict was primarily over land. Both of these peoples were expanding or at least moving around throughout the land of Canaan. During the century or so between 1100 and 1000 BCE, the Israelites and the Philistines were constantly at war with each other. The Old Testament then tells us that the Israelite king, David, defeated the Philistines, established his capital at Jerusalem, and ended up ruling much of Canaan in the process. From then onward, at least historically, we hear less and less about a specific people called the Canaanites. Whoever they were, their identity eventually became lost by the successive small kingdoms that popped up in the region, as well as invasions and migrations of others who found their way into Canaan. Now, that doesn't mean that the Canaanites just vanished. Most scholars believe that their culture and traditions simply continued with another people who, thanks to the Greeks, we call the Phoenicians. In fact, one could argue that the Phoenicians were nothing more than coastal Canaanites. We'll talk about them and other groups occupying Canaan in future programs. Anyway, thanks so much for stopping by the channel. I hope you learned something, and if you did, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and follow History with Cy on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. As always, keep the world safe for rock and roll, and catch you next time.